And thanks everyone for attending, for your patience. So my name is Danny Fadul and I'm from the AFTINET Working Party, and wanted to start by welcoming everyone for coming along to this webinar on such an important issue in our society right now. Also want to start by acknowledging that we are all meeting today on Indigenous land from various parts of Australia. In my case, I'm meeting from the land of the Darug people. And of course, that land was never ceded. And this is something where we always need to be acknowledging, especially at a time that we're in right now. Also, of course, want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and of course note that sovereignty has never been ceded. 2020 is a big year globally and also in Australia. It's also the 20th anniversary of AFTINET's founding. And since it's first got set up in 2000, it's had a long history of fighting for trade justice. We've got celebrations coming up with that commemoration of that huge anniversary that we'll let you know about a little bit later on. We've got 4 speakers for this webinar. They'll be speaking for 10 minutes each, and then we'll be followed by a Q&A session. If you want to ask a question, the chat box at the bottom of the screen is there. So if you want to put that your question in there, we'll go through those questions and then call on people to ask those questions or read that question out for you if you'd rather we do it that way. So I want to start off by introducing Pat Ranald. Dr. Patricia Ranald is an honorary research fellow at the University of Sydney and the convener of the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network. She's published widely on the social impacts of trade agreements and the right of global corporations to sue governments over public interest laws, something which obviously is of deep concern well, as soon as people are aware of it, which is something that we don't hear much about in the public discourse. That's why the work of AFTINET is so important. She'll be speaking about the dangers of global corporations using special rights in trade agreements to claim millions in compensation for government actions taken during the pandemic and the actions that governments need to take to prevent this travesty from taking place. Pat will be speaking for 10 minutes. Over to you, Pat.
Thanks, Danny. So I wanted to start with an overview of the pandemic and the economic crisis, which are both the health crisis and the world. We are now in a health crisis and the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. The WTO says global production and trade is estimated to fall between 13 to 30%. And we still have a climate crisis, which needs urgent action by governments. So there's going to be impacts on health, employment, living standards and labour rights in Australia. And of course, it's going to be worse in developing countries. Government action is needed to address both the health and economic crisis at a national level and cooperative action at the international level. And the problem is that flaws in current trade rules could impede the government action that's needed. And so we need to talk about how we can change them. So the flaws in the current trade rules are that, firstly, the framework is that each country should specialise in its most cost-competitive export products, import everything else at the lowest possible prices, have no active industry policies and minimise government regulation. So this leads to an overdependence on global production chains and lack of manufacturing capacity. We've also got intellectual property trade rules that reinforce medicine monopolies and impede access to medicines and vaccines. And the recovery from the economic crisis and addressing climate crisis will require government action that could be impeded by trade rules. So, and finally, and this is what I'm going to talk in more detail about, we've got foreign investment rights to sue governments over changes in law and policy as part of trade rules. And that means that governments could face demands for billions in compensation for actions needed to save lives. So what is ISDS, or investor-state dispute processes? All trade agreements have government-to-government dispute processes, and these are recognised and used by 164 members of the World Trade Organization in WTO agreements. But some bilateral and regional trade agreements outside the WTO also have investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS. So this means that there are special legal rights only for foreign investors, not local investors, to bypass national courts and sue governments for millions or even billions of dollars in international tribunals if they can argue that a change in law or policy damages their investment or they weren't consulted about it. Now, these tribunals are not like national courts. They're basically unfair, and this is because they're staffed by practicing advocates. There's no independent judges. There's no precedents or appeals, so the decisions don't have to be consistent. The main focus is whether the investor has suffered a loss, not whether the change in law or policy was in the public interest. And there are now over 1,000 known cases, mostly against developing countries, including against health, environmental and other public interest laws. That's according to the UN body which monitors these cases. So just some examples of cases. Most people have heard of the US Philip Morris Tobacco Company suing Australia over its plain packaging laws. They lost the case, but it took 7 years and cost $12 million to defend. So even when governments win, they lose a lot. There's also cases appearing against government action on climate change. For example, the US Westmoreland Coal Company is suing the Canadian government for a decision by the Alberta province to phase out coal-powered energy. Now, that has a lot of implications for governments wanting to take action on climate change. Costs awarded against governments can be not only millions, but billions of dollars because they include loss of future profits. And the latest example is in 2019, Pakistan was ordered to pay $5.8 billion to a mining company over a dispute about a mining lease. This was almost as much as the $6 billion emergency loan that Pakistan had just got from the IMF because it had financial problems. So what's happening now is that we do have evidence that corporations are now preparing to sue governments over actions taken during the pandemic. So one legal firm giving advice to its clients has said, while states may invoke force majeure and a state of necessity to justify their actions, as observed in previous crises that were economic in nature, these defences may not always succeed. And an example of this is that after its 2001 economic crisis, Argentina faced 50 ISDS claims over emergency measures it took, like freezing water and energy prices and restructuring of debt. And already this year, Peru cancelled road tolls to facilitate internal transport of essential goods as a result of the pandemic, and has been threatened with an ISDS case by private toll road operators. The UN body, Conference on Trade and Development body that I mentioned before, which monitors ISDS cases, has said that there is a danger of these cases, and also a number of legal scholars have confirmed this threat. So what should we do about it, and what has civil society, how has civil society been responding? Well, legal experts, a leading global economists like Jeffrey Sachs and other global figures, and 630 civil society groups are calling on governments to take action against ISDS. And there are basically three things that governments can do. Firstly, they can permanently restrict the use of ISDS for claims concerning the pandemic by negotiating with trading partner governments for withdrawal of consent from ISDS in relation to those measures. Now, this would mean that Australia would approach trading partners for trade agreements that contain ISDS and say to those trading partners, will you agree to suspend ISDS in relation to those sorts of measures? That can be done. Secondly, ISDS can be excluded from all current and future trade and investment agreements. ISDS is unpopular. There are campaigns against it. And for these reasons, ISDS has been excluded, for example, from the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement current negotiations, and from the RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations with 15 Asian countries. These include China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the 10 ASEAN countries. So it is possible to exclude ISDS, and we argue that if cases start to emerge against actions taken to the pandemic, then this will be more possible. And we also are arguing for a comprehensive review of existing agreements that include ISDS with a view to removing ISDS provisions. I'll just finish by saying that if you want more information about this, I'm happy to answer questions, but here is on the screen is some more information about AFTINET, our website address, and if you want to support or donate or join AFTINET, you can do so through the website. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Pat. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for that again, Pat. Now, our next speaker will be Deborah Gleeson. Dr. Debra Gleason is a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology and Public Health at Latrobe University. She also represents the Public Health Association of Australia on health and trade policy issues. She has published widely on the impacts of trade agreements on public health, including the use of trade agreements to entrench and or strengthen medicine monopolies, which delay access to cheaper forms of medicines. She will discuss the issues about trade agreements and access to medicines and vaccines revealed by the pandemic and the changes needed to address them. Deborah will be speaking for the next 10 minutes. Over to you, Deborah.
Thanks very much, Danny. I just need the host to enable screen sharing for me so that I can put my slides up on the screen. Thank you. So just while we're waiting for the slides, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And I'd like to join the hosts in paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land and to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. Okay, looks like I've got the slides now. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the slides. All right, so I'm going to talk about trade policy and access to medicines and vaccines. And of course, access to medicines and vaccines is a very topical issue right now during the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, just about everyone I know is talking about how we need a vaccine for COVID-19 before we'll be able to get back to normal. And there's an enormous amount of effort going on around the world to try and develop a vaccine. There's a race with more than 100 vaccines under development. And a lot of money is being spent by governments and donors to try and facilitate the development of a vaccine. But once we do have a vaccine for COVID-19 that's shown to be safe and effective, we face a whole lot of additional challenges in getting it out to the people who need it. And that's what I'm going to really explore in this presentation. Some of the challenges around access to medicines and vaccines, particularly the ones that are related to trade agreements. So I'm going to, first of all, talk about how research and development for medicines and vaccines is currently funded, some of the problems with this funding model, and particularly how COVID-19 highlights the broken model, what trade agreements have to do with the problem, and what we can do about it. So our current global regime for funding medicines and vaccines is to provide intellectual property rights to those who create these products to incentivise investment in research and development, R&D. And patents provide a time-limited monopoly during which other people can't manufacture or sell the product. But after the time-limited monopoly finishes, copies or similar products can be made. The rationale for this global regime is that research and development is costly and time-consuming. So it can take decades to develop a new product. It can take a very large investment of money in terms of development and testing and all of the clinical trials. And many products actually fail before they come to market. And so the rationale behind it is that without this reward, the investment wouldn't be made. But the really big problem with this model is that companies recoup the cost of their investment through the price of the product and while keeping competitors out of the market. And these are obviously particular problems during a public health emergency. So these problems are not new. This model has always been a problem. And perhaps the classic case study is the problem of access to antiretroviral drugs during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. In the 1990s, millions of people in Africa, where the epidemic had really taken hold, lacked access to drugs which were priced at a level that people in developed countries could afford, but people in Africa definitely could not. And until generic medicines were made available, that problem couldn't be solved. Since the HIV/AIDS epidemic, developing countries have faced ongoing problems with access to newer, highly priced medicines. And most recently, the issue has been not so much medicines for infectious diseases, but things like cancer medicines, which often cost up to hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient per year in countries like Australia. And in fact, some of these medicines that have been coming onto the market in recent years have been so expensive that they've put pressure on pharmaceutical expenditure, even in developed countries like Australia, the UK, and other countries where we expect our governments to be able to provide access to important drugs. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted these issues and brought them to the fore, and raised the question of how can we provide affordable, timely access to products for almost 7.8 billion people when we have a model that's based on high prices and limiting competition. And the case study of the experimental drug remdesivir really highlights the issues with the current intellectual property regime that we have. So remdesivir is a drug that's been developed by a US company called Gilead Sciences, and it was first developed for Ebola, and it's now being repurposed for COVID-19. It's still in the experimental phase, but it's showing a lot of promise at the moment. And Gilead Sciences has patents on this drug in a number of different countries. Even though it's a lot of public money has gone into developing this drug. And in fact, Gilead even applied for an extra period of exclusivity through the US Food and Drug Administration. The Gilead Sciences has given assurances that it's going to make this drug available to countries that where it could otherwise be priced out of reach. And it's negotiated voluntary licenses with pharmaceutical companies in India, Pakistan, and Egypt to produce the drug. But these companies will only be able to distribute it to 127 countries, which are mostly the lowest income countries. And a whole lot of countries, such as Brazil, Mexico, and China, that are larger middle income countries, are excluded from these licensing arrangements. So if you think about the situation in Brazil and Mexico at the moment, there's a really dire need in those countries, large numbers of cases, and yet those countries may not be able to afford to provide this drug under the current arrangements. So where do trade agreements come into all of this? Well, this really goes back to the negotiation of the World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, which came into force in 1995 and set a minimum global standard for intellectual property rights, including patent terms of at least 20 years. Many countries had patents before the TRIPS agreement came in, but they were of varying lengths, and some countries didn't allow any patents. For example, India. So before the TRIPS agreement, countries were able to determine their own patent terms based on their own circumstances. The TRIPS agreement changed all of this, but it also included some legal flexibilities to enable countries to protect public health, and particularly during emergencies. So these include things like compulsory licensing, where a patented invention can be exploited without the permission of the patent owner, where the price is too high, or where there's an emergency and it's necessary to produce large amounts of the drug quickly. So Australia has these mechanisms in our patent law, and we can use them to address shortages or high prices during the COVID-19 pandemic. Countries that have used these flexibilities or tried to use these flexibilities in the past have faced a lot of pressure from high-income countries that house a lot of the world's large pharmaceutical companies, particularly the US. And so it's not always easy for countries to use these mechanisms, even though they're allowable under the TRIPS agreement. And Australia is amongst 37 developed countries that actually voluntarily waived their right to import drugs that are produced under compulsory license in other countries. So this is a problem for Australia, because if we don't have the manufacturing capacity here, even if we issue a compulsory license, that might not help us. So there might be situations where we need to import drugs from other cheaper versions of drugs from other countries rather than making them here. Now, trade agreements that are negotiated outside the WTO often expand intellectual property rights even further than what's allowed, contained in the TRIPS agreement. So many recent trade agreements have included things like longer patent terms. They've made it easier to get a patent, easier to get more patents. They've included things like monopolies on the use of clinical trial data, protection of trade secrets, and strong enforcement of intellectual property protection. So these things have just exacerbated and added to the problems. So essentially, while they provide some safeguards for emergencies, trade agreements tend to lock us into this broken model that doesn't provide access to the level that we need it in all the places where it's needed. So what can we do about this problem? Well, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, one really important thing to do is to encourage countries to use the flexibilities that we have within the current trade agreements. So as I mentioned, we have compulsory licensing provisions in our patent law in Australia, and also what's called Crown use, which means that the minister can actually, the health minister can actually issue a direction for a license to be granted to produce a drug. So we need the government to be willing to use those legal flexibilities, and to encourage other countries to do that as well, even when they face pressure from the larger developed countries. We also need to explore different funding models that break that link between the funding of research and development and the price of the product. We need to find other ways to fund research and development that don't mean we have to limit access and have high prices. We need to also develop mechanisms to share intellectual property. And one really good example is the COVID-19 technology access pool that's been developed under the World Health Organization. This was first proposed by Costa Rica in March and launched by the WHO in May. And 39 countries have signed up to endorse this initiative to try and share the know-how, the technology, and the tools needed to come up with things like diagnostic tests, medicines, vaccines, and other things that we need to combat COVID-19. But this and other voluntary initiatives, the Open COVID Pledge is another one, depend on the willingness of patent owners to contribute their intellectual property, or the willingness of national governments to enforce them doing that through the conditions that they place on public funding. So while we can set up these things, there's no current mechanisms to have them enforced at the global level, which is a real problem. And so far, Australia hasn't endorsed the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. So thinking beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, we also need to rethink the way that we negotiate trade agreements, and particularly the intellectual property chapters. So we need to think about different ways of doing these things that actually promote rather than limit access. And perhaps when we're thinking about enforcement, we can look at enforcement of sharing and collaboration rather than enforcement of individual rights to property. So we also need to reverse the trend to expand and extend intellectual property rights through trade agreements. It's not a good idea to be negotiating trade agreements during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we really need to be focused on doing things differently, and we really need to have a fundamental rethink of the whole regime. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion time later.
Thank you so much for that, Deborah. Okay, so the next speaker that we're going to have is Sam Cossar-Gilbert. Sam Cossar-Gilbert is the International Program Coordinator for Economic Justice for Friends of the Earth International, and has contributed to their publications on the environmental impacts of trade deals. Sam has worked in environmental and social justice movements for over a decade as a student activist, a trade union organiser, a trainer in citizen media, and an environmental justice campaigner with Friends of the Earth Australia. Sam will discuss the central role for renewable energy and other environmental programs as part of the post-COVID economic recovery, and the need for changes in trade rules to enable this. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, thank you. Just wait 1 second. Can you hear me all right? Cool. All right, just wait 1 second. Well, thank you very much for having me today and the introduction. Just first wanted to echo what others have said around what a massive crisis we're facing in terms of a health crisis, an ecological crisis, and an environmental crisis at the moment with climate change. I just wanted to structure this talk by first talking a bit about the global trade system before COVID, briefly about some of the impacts on the system during and now from COVID, and then what does a just and sustainable recovery look like, and then what role can trade play in not hindering that or actually supporting it. So in terms of the global trade system before COVID, and I'll just look at, if you look at the photo here on the left, this is in the Niger Delta, and we were there recently. We're bringing a court case against Shell, and some of the petrol that we consume here in Australia may have come from this area, and this really highlights, I guess, the gross inadequacies in the trade system before COVID, in that it was very difficult to get justice and social protection on traded products.
Sam, just a quick question, if it's possible for you to go to screen share, because people can only see a fraction of the slides that you want to present with. So sorry to interrupt.
What was that, sorry?
Could you try and use slideshow on your PowerPoint presentation, because some of the folks indicating that it's hard to see the slides you want to show.
It needs to be on. It needs to be on presentation or full screen or something.
Ooh, okay, 1 second. Sorry about that.
Thanks for that, Sam, and thanks everyone for pointing it out in the chat.
Thank
That's really
you very
helpful.
much, team. I'll try again. Is that better?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sam.
So much better?
Yes.
Cool. So I guess the first point was around the global trade system before COVID, and that it was leading to a race to the bottom and was quite difficult to get social and environmental protection. And one example is this photo here from the Niger Delta. Also, what we see in the global trade system before COVID is there was a real preference towards dirty energy and dirty products. So that the tariff rate, the dirty products that have a lot of carbon, things like coal, oil, gas, all had lower taxes and tariffs than clean renewable energy panels. And it's estimated that some $500 billion difference there. So there was a preference and a bias towards not a sustainable trade, but a dirty trade system. Then we have the items such as ISDS that Pat mentioned, that enables corporations to sue governments for doing things like stopping a mine. We also see just a trade policy without a purpose. So the purpose was always increased trade at any cost, regardless of whether the increased shipping led to greater emissions or the increased trade at any cost led to much greater consumption and environmental destruction. So this is the trade system before COVID. Some of the impacts, and also worth noting that Australia plays quite a strong role in this as one of the lead exporters of coal and dirty products. I think as Pat alluded to, there's COVID has led to a massive lack of demand in the global trade system. So you'll see a 40% drop in investment, up to a 30% drop in traded goods. And in terms of environmental impact that this is having, you've seen a massive drop in the energy market. So world oil prices fell below zero for a short time there. Coal prices have plummeted, gas has plummeted, and then this flows on into real-life environmental issues. So things like the Adani coal mine that people have heard about, which was dependent on coal prices and was already on shaky economic grounds, now after COVID is on even shakier ground. And if we look at this massive decline in energy products, and people are saying this could be also structural over the long term. So it may just be temporary, but things like the decline in the coal market could be structural over the long term. And at Friends of the Earth, we think we need to have a just and orderly transition to an ecological society, and that we need to really have much more planning rather than these dramatic changes. So I think it's interesting also to note just that renewable energy over this COVID time has greatly increased its share of electricity in all major markets. So if you look in Europe, in May, renewable energy as a percentage of electricity was 55%. So the trend is that COVID is having a major impact on the global trading system, particularly in energy markets and tradable energy products. So at Friends of the Earth, we believe that we need a just and sustainable recovery. And we've produced a number of detailed policy papers on what that would look like, but it's really around dealing with the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and now this health crisis simultaneously. And we think public investment is a really strong way to deal with this crisis, things like 100 or even more than 100% renewable energy. And currently we're exporting coal and gas, which cause dangerous climate change, when we could actually be exporting renewable energy. This photo here on the left is of a project that's moderately developed, the Asian Energy Hub, that would look at exporting renewable energy from Australia to Asia. So we really need to be forward thinking in how we move forward in this crisis. Other parts of the just and sustainable recovery we think are ecological and landscape restoration, public transport. But all of these things require massive government intervention and also public funding. So it's really important. That's how we see the government taking a really strong role in leading this just and sustainable recovery together with communities across the country. And it's really important that trade deals do not hinder this process. So what we can see and I think Pat alluded to one of them is ISDS, but also there are a number of other trade policies that can impact environmental and sustainable just recovery. So what we need to see is promoting and fostering of a trade and sustainable goods and services rather than a focus on trade flows. And an example of that could be the creation of a green hydrogen industry here in Australia. And that would need an industrial policy and government support and subsidies. And some of those things are currently prohibited or difficult under trade deals. And so what we really need to see is trade policy helping a just and sustainable recovery, not hindering it as it is currently doing. So governments, we really think, need flexibility to be able to support a just and sustainable recovery. We then need to create a framework to hold corporations accountable internationally. So currently under the trade deals, corporates can sue governments, but if you're an impacted person in Nigeria, you can't sue Shell. And what we need is international courts. There is currently a UN binding treaty on multinational enterprises, but also last week the European Commissioner for Justice said they want to have a mandatory human rights due diligence framework that would hold European companies accountable for what they do outside Europe within Europe. And in Australia, these debates are starting as well, and we really need to be pushing for them. Because trade is not just about goods traded, but how and the standards of the products we buy here in Australia and what's happened in the process and the value chain of making them. So another point is around improving standards internationally. We also need to look at how to strengthen the implementation of other international agreements, climate agreements, not just the trade ones. And we've got this kind of imbalance at the moment where trade and financial agreements have much more power than other international agreements. And that's because they have binding rules that can be implemented. So the WTO has dispute resolution, but the climate negotiations don't. And what we really need to see is a rebalancing of this, where human rights and environmental agreements have priority over trade and investment agreements. And then next, a key part for us of the just and sustainable recovery is really fostering local economies. We need to have a common sense approach to hyper-globalization. You know, if you could get your orange from sustainable local producer from Mildura rather than 1,000 kilometers overseas, we really need to be looking at that. And we of course we're going to be integrated into the global economy, but we don't need this globalization at all costs. And we really need to foster local economies rather than just trying to increase trade flows. And finally, I think it's really important. The just and sustainable recovery is really about good governance and about us, as in the health crisis, we've really looked towards government to provide the answers, but also to work together. And currently, trade negotiations are completely secret. You look at the RCEP trade negotiations, you don't even know the text. So what we really think moving forward is we need to have much more democratic scrutiny over these trade negotiations rather than being kept in secret. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. If you want to just no longer share your screen, that would be fantastic. Okay, let's just get rolling. Great, thanks so much for that, Sam. Okay, and we're going to have our final speaker, who is Andrew Dettmer. Andrew Dettmer is the National President of the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. He has over 20 years experience as a union official, including as the Secretary of the Queensland branch and National Industrial Officer of the AMWU. He's a board member of Safe Work Australia and of TAFE Queensland, and Andrew's been actively involved in developing policies for local industry development, government procurement and skills training, and in presenting them to government. He's also analysed the impact of trade agreements on manufacturing industry. Andrew will discuss the lack of local capacity to produce essential medical equipment revealed by the pandemic and the need for changes in trade policies to enable more diverse local industry development and local jobs as part of the post-COVID recovery process. And Andrew will be speaking for 10 minutes. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. So I welcome the opportunity to speak today. AFTINET and the AMW have had a long and abiding relationship, and long may that continue to be so. It's a pity, unfortunately, that we have to continue to campaign against these rotten trade agreements, which are neither free nor fair. And so it really is good to have good comrades in the struggle to ensure that what Australia does as the nation state is to institute fair trade, which is all about developing our own capacity as well as resolving to and dealing with the issue of a carbon constrained economy. So the current pandemic has brought into stark relief some of the least desirable aspects of our current economic situation. And this is especially so as regards manufacturing, and it's impacted very poorly upon manufacturing, as have free trade agreements, which have really done a terrible disservice to our capacity to provide our own medical and essential equipment. I'll deal with it in a minute. What we see, if the thing won't scroll down, I don't know. What we see is Australia has an absence of value adding in local products. Probably the most startling example of this at the moment is liquid natural gas. In Australia, LNG is derived from coal seam gas, which is piped and transported to conversion plants, which then convert to LNG for transportation under pressure. LNG is produced through various production facilities, including those at Curtis Island near Gladstone and Darwin at the Ichthys plant. The LNG transported overseas is further refined in overseas terminals. The costly irony is that this is then transported back to Australia. The same Australian LNG transported to Japan and is then re-imported to Australia.
Just undo.
Lack of any downstream processing in Australia, and regardless of whether you believe that LNG is the road to the future or a sheet anchor from our past, it is a stark illustration of the limitations of Australia's trade position as an exporter of primary products. And this is only being exacerbated by, as probably everybody on this hookup knows, we have significant numbers of free trade agreements now in place, and the impact on Australian manufacturing has been quite dire. Formerly, Australia had significant trade in elaborately transformed manufactures. In 2019, however, we only exported $37.7 billion worth of them. However, this contrasts with the importation of $216 billion worth of ETMs at the same time. So, and that is the vast majority of our trade deficit. The Australian trade deficit was around $40 billion in 1995, and it's now $180 billion. Jim Stanford of the Centre for Future Work out that Australia's need for manufacturing in 2018, which is the last year we have good figures for, we needed $565 billion worth, or 30% of our GDP in manufactured products. However, at the same time, we only produced $380 billion worth of manufactured products. In other words, we can only produce 68% of our needs in simple and elaborately transformed manufacturing. Since 1995, Australia's manufacturing industry has gone backwards. Since 1995 and 2019, our reliance on primary products in Australian exports, went from approximately 43% of our economy to nearly 75%. In other words, 75% of total Australian merchandise exports were primary products. The profusion of free trade agreements has led to the halving of our manufacturing industry. The theory of comparative advantage, so-called, suggests that Australia is a place which should only concentrate on our natural resources. Yet this was, in fact, a choice made by successive governments. If you contrast this with the previous 40 years, the period of Australia's post-war recovery and beyond, when a specific policy encouraging Australian manufacturing industry was passed only with the advent of the free trade obsessed Howard government in 1996 that FTAs suddenly became flavour of the month, if not the decade, and the backbone of Australian government policy. In that time, we have lost significant amounts of Australian manufacturing because the average annual growth rate of manufactured imports was faster than the average annual growth of manufactured exports. In two of the cases, the US and Chile, Australia's manufactured exports actually declined in the first 5 years that the trade agreements were in effect. The average annual growth of manufactured imports in the first years of the 8 free trade agreements was 2.6 times faster than the average growth rate of our own manufactured exports. We get told what a success the China FTA is. However, whilst it has been successful in increasing our manufactured exports, the fact that it is pretty much all of the increases have been in food and meat products and beverages, that is, simply transformed manufacturers. It is otherwise a very slow rate of increase. But we also know now that China has been prepared to go on the attack against Australia, and they have done that by imposing, one of the things they've done is by imposing a major duty on our barley and other products. And this appears not to be for trade purposes, rather it appears to be for the carrying out of foreign policy by other means. The chapter, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, for this very reason provides us with significant political problems, which no amount of tinkering will resolve. The direct impact of COVID has been accentuated and exacerbated by FTAs in Australia. We know, for instance, that whereas 30 years ago, Australia was more or less self-sufficient in surgical masks, but at the time that the pandemic hit, that we had transitioned to a situation where there was only one small manufacturer of surgical masks left at Shepparton in Victoria, and that this company was only producing 5% of Australia's needs. And the army has had to be brought in to ramp up production to ensure that there would be enough surgical masks. And whilst it has been very heartening that Dettmer in South Australia has been able to produce surgical masks and will be likely to produce over 100 million of them in a very short period, in the meantime, the national stockpile has been run down significantly. Even worse, much of the material in the national stockpile has been substandard. The surgical masks which were sent to various state jurisdictions were found to be non-compliant. At the same time, Amcor Flexibles has been ramping up production for food packaging. The vast majority of Australia's food packaging containers come from China. The China-Australia FTA has resulted in Australian manufacturing being diminished, as I've just said. We know that food production companies need good sterile food containers, but it is only with maximum effort that these companies like Amcor Flexible and Visy have been able to produce food containers for the Australian food industry, and of course, as we know, in some instances, toilet paper. The situation we are facing is similar to that confronting Australia at the end of World War II. At that time, Australia made a mighty effort for post-war reconstruction. The department of the same name had Ben Chifley as its minister, and Nugget Coon effort this time to ensure that the Australian economy does not falter. They and the millions of Australian workers who built our economy and society were mainly in manufacturing. Manufacturing was the key to our recovery. We would do very well to emulate them. And that's all from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. Deeply appreciate that. And all four speakers did really, really well, and apologies for any of the technical issues that we've had throughout the course of those presentations. So thank you again for that. Okay, we're going to go over to questions, and we've got an order of questions that have come through, which is great. So first things first, I'm going to read out a question from Harry Creamer, which is addressed to the panel, which is, what are the chances of having a border adjusted carbon price in the EU and UK free trade agreements? So do any of the panel want to have a crack at that question?
I'm happy to do it. So it's Pat here. The EU is developing a system of measuring the carbon intensity of both products produced in the EU and products imported. They haven't developed it yet, and it's going to take some while to develop. Once it's developed, they're saying they may then apply this to both domestic products and imported products, and that would mean that if a product didn't meet the standard of low carbon intensity, then it could have some kind of border tax or some other restriction. But the EU Free Trade Agreement is being negotiated at the moment, and I think will probably be concluded sometime next year. So it's not clear that that will actually be in place, or whether the EU will want to apply it in relation to that agreement. They could have some kind of clause in it which says that when it is developed it could apply, but I haven't heard yet that that's been proposed.
Thanks for that, Pat. Any of the other panelists want to have a go at that question?
I can post in the chat. There was this, I think I mentioned in my talk, there was a recent paper done by the University of Berkeley looking not just at the issue of carbon adjusted tariffs, but also, yeah, the issue of that currently dirty products, fossil fuel heavy products, be it oil, gas, and coal, face much lower tariffs than clean products. So even this paper argued from quite a, so if you think about it, we kind of have at the moment a fossil fuel dominated trade system, not a free trade system, or even less the sort of ecological and sustainable trade system that Friends of the Earth are promoting. But yeah, it was quite strong figures around the 500 billion in the differentiation of the subsidies and taxes given to clean products versus dirty products. I think the European Union has been taking this issue quite seriously for a number of years. I wouldn't be surprised to see a carbon adjusted tariff come into place in the next few years. But it is only one policy. And really the Green New Deal and the sort of stimulus packages we're seeing now, that's where the main game is at. While the border adjustments are important, like the carbon tax here in Australia, very important policy, but also we really need to be looking for 100% renewable energy. We really need to just be having, and now is the time for these big government investments to transform our economy and our energy.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Sam. Unless Andrew or Deborah want to chime in, I will see if Leslie Gruitt, who is the next questioner, wants to ask her question via video, or if she'd prefer that I ask that question for her. So Leslie's question.
Hi, Danny. You can ask the question. That's fine.
No, go for it, Leslie, please.
Okay. Deborah, thank you. I just wanted to know if we had any information about why Australia has not endorsed the CTAP.
Thanks, Leslie. That's a really good question. We don't, but the CTAP has only been in existence for really a few weeks. And since the WHO set it up, we've seen countries starting to sign up to it. So I think that the chances are good that we might be able to persuade the Australian government to support that initiative. Even more than important than actually supporting that initiative is that Australia starts expecting pharmaceutical companies and researchers who are working on vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 to be contributing their intellectual property to that pool or to other initiatives that have been set up. And there's a whole lot of different things going on in this space. It's very busy at the moment in terms of various mechanisms being set up. But because all of these things are voluntary, unless national governments actually require companies to use them, and really the only levers that they have to do that at the moment are funding, we're not likely to see very much sharing going on of things that really need to be shared if we're going to be able to scale up access. So I think this is a really critical time for civil society organisations to be engaging in advocacy around these issues and getting the Australian government to contribute to solidarity initiatives like this and requiring our pharmaceutical companies to comply and researchers.
Great, thanks so much for that, Deborah. The next question I've got is from Peter Murphy, and that question is, why did Australia waive its rights to import generic drugs, and are you aware of any debate about reversing that move? And I think that's mainly aimed at you, Deborah, but if other panelists want to answer that question, more than welcome to too.
Thanks, Peter. That's another really good question. I don't know why Australia agreed to waive its rights to import drugs under compulsory license from other countries. I think that it was a very short-sighted decision that would have taken place quite some time ago, when a situation like COVID-19 was very far from the government's mind, and probably a lot of developed countries thought that they would never be in the position where they might need to do that. You know, we've certainly seen a lack of imagination at the global level in terms of what things might be like in a public health emergency that spans the whole globe. I think that you know, it was 37 countries that agreed to waive their rights, and I think that you know, they were probably put under a lot of pressure by the pharmaceutical industry to do that as a concession to the pharmaceutical industry, and it would have been mainly developed countries that have large pharmaceutical sectors that would have agreed to do that. There have been moves to reverse that decision. So there has been a civil society letter to trade ministers about reversing that waiver, and I think the EU has indicated that it will look into doing that, although I don't, to my knowledge, no countries have actually taken legal action to do that so far. I hope that answers your question, Peter.
Thanks so much for that, Deborah. And unless any other panelists want to answer that question, we might see if Ingrid Johnston wants to ask her question. So if we can unmute Ingrid.
Yeah, thank you very much. Over the past few months, we've seen governments around the world and in Australia implement policies that we would have thought were impossible a few months ago. But as Pat mentioned, corporations aren't exactly necessarily following suit. I'm wondering if anyone has seen any indications that governments are prepared to also have strong action in the trade sector relating to COVID.
I'll have a go at that. I do think there is some indication from our own government that they are prepared to look at some of these issues. First of all, there is a parliamentary inquiry that they've set up looking at the impact of the pandemic on trade policy, but also foreign affairs and defence. And we'll certainly be making submissions to that on trade policy. But I think more significantly, the Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, last week made a speech at the press club in which he actually said that trade policy needed some adjustments and to be more flexible, and to acknowledge that, for instance, there might be over-dependence on global production chains, and the sort of thing that Andrew was talking about, a lack of capacity to not only produce medical products and medicines, but he even mentioned things like infrastructure. So I do think that the realities of the pandemic have to some extent impinged on the sort of ideology of free trade, and that there is an opening there across the political spectrum. And the thing is that we need to be in there advocating for the sorts of changes that we think should happen to enable trade policy to actually support not only ending the pandemic, but also reconstructing the economy, addressing climate change, preventing global corporations from suing governments, etc.
Thanks, Pat. Anyone else want to dive into that particular question? Nope. Okay, so the next question that I've got comes from Kate Lee, and it is aimed at Sam. And so Kate asks, how do Friends of the Earth groups in the Global South reconcile policies for fostering local economies and the dependence which is developed on manufacturing for global North countries? In some South countries, for example, closed manufacturing in the Asia Pacific region. Notwithstanding the violations of labour rights and poverty wages paid to these workers, unions in these countries are worried about withdrawal of contracts and massive job losses which have developed in the last few months. Sam, do you want to have a go at that? And if anyone else wants to answer it, more than welcome to as well.
It's a good question. So I think it really comes down to the purpose of trade policy and the purpose of what we're trying to achieve broadly in society. So where governments are enacting policy, when we talk about fostering local economy, it's really around, you know, governments trying to enact policy for just and sustainable societies. And I'll give you one example. And we're not saying that all things and all products should be made here in Australia. And solar panels are one example. Solar panels have been, and I'll use the example of Uganda. So Uganda acknowledged they were not going to have a cheap solar panel manufacturing in their country. They reduced tariffs greatly on solar panels. So we're importing panels mainly from China, and therefore had a bit of a subsidy program and a good distribution as well. And we're able to get cheap solar panels to lots and lots of people. So yeah, in that way, that's using trade policy, international trade policy, to foster sustainable development. But what we generally see is just this laissez-faire approach to saying everything should be global, everything is always best global, and really it's actually hurt a lot the countries of the global south, particularly small-scale agricultural producers. So our groups say to us a lot, you know, it's very difficult for some small-scale sustainable peasants to compete with Australian wheat, for example, or Australian rice. So the protections and the fostering of local economies, as I referred to, I think is really about protecting sustainable livelihoods, and is very much needed in the global south countries as well as the global north countries. With regards to electronics and clothing, our approach has been that we really need to have stronger rules that ensure human rights. So currently what we have is a bunch of voluntary commitments for human rights, but what we really need to see is mandatory human rights due diligence, and even stronger principles. And Friends of the Earth France, with the trade union, campaigned and won a law called the Loi de Vigilance, which is able to, and it was after the Ramza Plaza incident, it was able to now take French companies to court, clothing manufacturers, but also oil companies, for the human rights abuses that they're committing overseas. So I think it's, in terms of how we do the global trade system, we need to have strong regulation that ensures human rights and environmental protection that's binding and enforceable. We need to have an active trade policy rather than that is towards creating a just and ecological society, rather than just saying globalization at all costs.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sam. Any of the other panelists want to dive into that issue?
Just briefly, Danny, I don't disagree with anything that Sam said. The issue for us, I think, as a trade union movement is that on the one hand, we've tried to force the hand of those clothing companies like H&M, who have been exploiting cheap labour and corrupt labour practices in places like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, etc., for many years now. And part of that has been by trying to engage those companies, the ultimate users of the products, in a global compact. And Industrial, the Global Union Federation that we're affiliated to, has taken quite a good role in that process. Part of that, of course, has been, and the initiative towards it was the Rana Plaza disaster, where over 1,000 people lost their lives, and it did actually make many of the large international clothing companies actually sit up and take notice. But what we now find is that not only do we have the continued erosion of the agreement in Bangladesh that arose from Rana Plaza, but now we have the situation where H&M is just simply refusing to pay. And there are many, many thousands. On the one hand, we've tried to do the right thing for those workers, with those workers, which I think is you know, what we're really enjoined to do as trade unionists internationally. But the problem has been that good old capital has done its usual thing, which is when it gets a bit tough, they walk away. Really, it's I suppose it's almost like, do we expect the leopard to change its spots? We did expect there to be a level of social responsibility. We did expect there to be a level of honour. We did expect there to be binding towards those agreements that have been reached. But what we have now is a situation where it appears that these large multinational apparel companies and their purchases, the Walmarts and what have you, are basically saying, you know, they're prepared to walk. Families and their communities suffer as a result. So the pandemic has had large numbers of impacts, not all of them predictable, and that's, I suppose, one of the less predictable outcomes that we would have expected. And I think that there is a really big problem with those garment producers and those garment producing companies, and what's going to happen with those workers and the communities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Andrew, and thank you also, Sam. We're now going to throw to a video question from Tim Woodruff. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks very much. My question, I suppose, is directed mainly to Deb. It's regarding your suggestions, both short and long term, to address the issues of medicine access, etc. Particularly in the for the short term suggestions, what representations to government and opposition has been done with respect to those, and has there been a response? And secondly, were the suggestions put to the Senate Select Committee that is currently kind of in session on the Senate Select Committee on COVID-19?
Thanks very much for the questions, Tim. When Costa Rica originally floated its proposal for a global intellectual property pool for COVID-19 treatments and vaccines and other products, we wrote to the Public Health Association of Australia wrote to Greg Hunt to urge Australia to support that that proposal. To my knowledge, and Ingrid might want to comment on this when I finished, but to my knowledge, we haven't received a formal response to that letter yet, but we were pleased to see that Australia seemed to support the World Health Assembly resolution that went to the May World Health Assembly that supported such a mechanism being set up. And so we're hopeful that Australia will actually endorse the, the mechanism that's coming out of that. Although I think there's still some work to do around making sure that the government does act on that. We also, the Public Health Association of Australia has also made a submission to the Senate inquiry into the COVID-19 response, and we wrote a section of the submission about what Australia needs to do in terms of using the flexibilities in our patent law and supporting other countries to use those flexibilities, and also getting that waiver reversed so that we can import drugs under compulsory license from other countries, and also in terms of looking at new models for trade agreements going into the future. So again, I think there's more work to do. That's one mechanism that we've used. There's also an inquiry, I'm sure Pat will talk about this later, an inquiry into trade policy or a submissions process looking at Australia's Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade response to the crisis, and we need to use that and other opportunities to raise these issues with the government. Thanks, Tim.
Can I just supplementary? Can I just say, did you also send that same letter that you sent to Greg Hunt to the opposition?
No, we didn't, but we did have some communication with some shadow ministers' offices around the issues, which I think will probably be ongoing.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Pat, do you want to supplement that answer with those inquiries now? Would that be a good time?
Yeah, that's the inquiry that I mentioned before, which is an inquiry into the effect of the pandemic on Australia's trade policy and foreign affairs and defence. So AFTINET is making a submission to that inquiry. We've circulated it to all our member organisations, and we're encouraging them all to make submissions as well. And when we do so, we'll try and get some media publicity, op-eds and things around that as well. So we're certainly planning to take that opportunity to not only present our views to the government and the opposition and the crossbenchers who are on that committee, but also to try and have some broader media publicity about it.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Pat. And of course, go to www.aftinet.org.au to get more details about those processes and to be on the AFTINET email list to stay up to date with what's going on and making sure you have your say. We've got about another 17 minutes before we're scheduled to finish up. So I'm probably going to read the remaining questions that we have, because we still have a few questions to go through. So the next one is from Louise Pratt, and that is the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, which is a multilateral aid agency, said that they can work through the urgent trade issues with regards to access to COVID-19 vaccines. Are they just saying this because they need to do their best to pull drug companies in, or do they have real leverage through their buying power? Have countries made investment in research conditional on access to vaccine outcomes, and will this leave poorer countries behind if they can't contribute? I think that sounds like, Deb, that might be a great question for you to start answering.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Danny. I haven't looked really closely yet at the Gavi initiative. I'm aware that that's been developing and need to have a good look at that. But I think what the issue is going to be is lack of access amongst the middle income countries. I think that Gavi works with the poorest countries, and I think that there will be mechanisms to ensure that the poorest countries can get access, because so many organisations are working on these issues. But the problems are really going to be in the really large, heavily populated middle income countries, where the pharmaceutical industry is still going to want to get a good return on its investment, and will still have hopes of being able to charge a significant price for the products. And so I think that's where the problems will really lie, even if we do have initiatives that are really working to deliver access to the poorest countries in the world. I can see the other question that you've asked there is whether countries have made investment in research conditional on access to vaccine outcomes, and I might, perhaps we can discuss that by email afterwards. I'd have to look into that to check whether any countries have actually done that, unless David Legg might know, because I know he's following these issues as well, and I think he's here on the call as well. Yeah, and that's a good point, that poorer countries might be left behind if they can't contribute. And I think it's a concern that most of the countries that have so far signed up to the WHO COVID-19 technology access pool are actually developing countries. It's not the big developed countries that have a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are the main ones signing up to that initiative, which is a concern.
Fantastic, thanks for that, Deborah. And Louise gives a thumbs up in the chat to me and on that one. So I think that was a great answer. The next one is a double-barreled question from Suganthi Singaraya. Firstly, to Dr. Patricia Ranald, I assume some companies want certainty and redress before investing in a country. Would countries continue to invest if ISDS was not available to them? And the question for Andrew Dettmer was, the high Australian wages are cited as an issue for moving manufacturing overseas, even if items such as masks are not made in Australia. why would companies want to relocate to Australia if companies argue that wages will continue to be an issue? So Pat first, and then over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Aganthi. Yes, this has been a constant argument from the advocates of ISDS that global corporations want certainty for their investments. But if you look at the empirical evidence, there's not a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that governments that don't have ISDS lack investment, or vice versa. If they have ISDS, they necessarily get a whole lot more investment. So for instance, if you look at a country like Brazil, Brazil has never agreed to any ISDS provisions in any of its trade agreements, and yet it's had a very good record in the past. I'm not saying right now where they've got a lot of problems, but in the past they've had a very good record of attracting international investment. And the same thing has happened with other countries that have reviewed or not entered into ISDS agreements. South Africa's another one. Indonesia's another one. They all still have quite good levels of foreign investment. And there's no evidence to suggest that having ISDS agreements then automatically leads to a jump in foreign investment.
Thanks, Pat. Over to you, Andrew, on the wage question.
Yes, and thank you. It's a very important question, and one that often is provided as some sort of excuse for not having a proper manufacturing base in Australia. The fact is that Australia, of the 36 OECD countries, is the one with the least amount of manufacturing by value and by activity. We are worse than Chile. In fact, New Zealand is about 8 places higher than us. If you think of the top countries, if you can discount Ireland because they have some very dodgy accounting practices and transfer payments because of various tech companies that use Ireland as their base. If you think of the top countries within the OECD, Germany, Netherlands, South Korea, Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, Belgium, Japan, they all have higher wages than us. They all have a bigger manufacturing industry than us. They all produce their own medical equipment, and to a greater or lesser extent, they're able to deal with the issues arising out of the pandemic because they can produce or very quickly obtain through their own means the necessary surgical masks, etc., which are required. Surgical masks are an essential part of any response to any pandemic. As I said in my remarks, the problem we have is that we have over 100 million surgical masks in the national stockpile. Where, however, that the various states which have derived their supply of surgical masks from that national stockpile have had to reject most of them because they were not conforming to safety requirements. So it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, we have wages, which of course capital is always seeking to reduce, and the latest national wage case shows that they will continue to complain that wages are too high, but that appears to apply to everybody and not just in manufacturing. But we also know that these other countries are able to be self-sufficient in medical equipment and protective equipment, PPE, in the pandemic, and provide their own. They don't seem to have a problem with wages. As I say, their wages are all higher than ours in those countries that I read out, and yet capital is continually saying that our wages are too high for us to be doing something as fundamental as producing our own surgical masks. I think Dettmer by the way, no relation, in South Australia have given the light of that, but also other companies such as ResMed, which has converted very urgently to the production of respirators because there was a belief that there would be a need for, I think, double the number of respirators, about 10,000 were required. Thankfully, because the pandemic has not been as severe as expected, they haven't been required, but nevertheless they were able to convert, and it wasn't a matter of wages that was preventing them from being produced. It was simply that ResMed was not able to get into what is a fairly exclusive area of medical equipment. Now they have. It remains to be seen whether or not they'll retain that product line, but they were able to very quickly convert to. They were very quickly able to convert one of their production lines to the production of respirators. They've all become been assessed as being up to the appropriate TGA standard, and nobody at any time suggested their wages were too high.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Andrew, and thank you also for that, Pat. Okay, we've got 2 more questions and then we'll wrap, which is great because we're going to be finishing at 3:30. The first question is from Simon Moffat, which is, how do we promote the sort of suggestions or concerns that some are arguing when this has all been done in a neoclassical, neoliberal, political, economic, financial system where the interests of those in power don't align with these suggestions? And I might suggest we start with Pat on this one, and then Sam, and if Andrew and Deb want to join on that, that'll be fantastic as well. Go, Pat.
Yes, well, I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic is that it is kind of busting through some of these ideological divisions. I agree with you that if we look at our trade framework that's developed over the last 20 years, it can be described as an extreme neoliberal trade framework, which definitely favours the interests of global corporations over the interests of people and the planet. But the realities of the pandemic have meant that the more extreme forms of that, of expression of that trade framework, for instance, the idea that you must just concentrate on exports, in Australia's case, minerals and farm exports, rather than having a more balanced economy and having the government actually acting to ensure that the economy has, for instance, a range of manufacturing capacities. That has now been punctured, I think. And so I don't think it means that we've won the whole debate, but I do think that there is a chance now for us to be arguing that that kind of ideological approach does not work in the current world situation, and that we can take the opportunity to argue for a more balanced approach to trade, not only for more balanced manufacturing industry, but also to tackle some of the medicine monopolies and to tackle the issue of corporations being able to sue governments.
Thanks. Sam, do you want to add to that? I know some of your answers earlier in your presentation touched on this as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a question really about how we bring about change more broadly. And I think, yeah, I would really encourage people to get active. I mean, Friends of the Earth, we see change happening through collective action. So groups of people getting organised, whether it's joining an organisation like Friends of the Earth or becoming a member of your trade union or getting active in health activism and politics. We really see that as the driver of change. Yeah, groups of people coming together in movements, progressive movements make change, and you know, everything from the 8-hour day to in Victoria here we helped to win the Victorian renewable energy target, which is we're gonna get to over 50% by 2025. So I think people getting active does make change. In terms of trade policy specifically, I think there's a window open now, and yeah, I really encourage people to get involved in AFTINET, and you know, both. And for me, one of the things is really challenging some of those base economic neoliberal ideas that are not substantiated by data. And yeah, really, so getting active, using the moment to think strategically, because there is a space open. And Pat's point about the trade minister saying we need to readjust trade policy is a big point. And I think if you look at India as well, a number of other places, the EU, this discussion is really up for discussion now, as it hasn't been for decades. So yeah, get involved, and then from our side, I think really trying to challenge and learn more about the broader economic arguments is important as well.
Fantastic, thanks for that, Sam. Andrew or Deb, do you want to add to that?
No, thanks, Danny. I think that all the important points are probably being covered there.
No problems. Thanks, Deb. Andrew?
Danny, I would just simply amplify that the only way that we are going to be able to seize this moment is through collective action. You wouldn't expect a trade union official to say anything different, I suppose, but politically, what we're seeing, I think, is a moment or series of moments in which collective action has been seen to be not only attracting the views and support of many millions of people around the world, maybe billions of people around the world, but it's also become effective. The Black Lives Matter protests, I think, are probably the most prominent ones, and notwithstanding the panicked statements of the various right-wing bloviators who occupy the airwaves, it has been effective, and it has changed the debate in most of the Western world, let alone in the United States. And I think that whether or not people are engaged and involved in the issues around Black Lives Matter, and they do, of course, have huge resonance in Australia because of the situation with our Aboriginal and First Nations people in Australia. But it is showing the value of collectivism, and it is showing the importance of developing policy in a collective manner and implementing it and executing it in a collective manner. And I can only think that that's a great environment for AFTINET to be reinvigorating its arguments around trade, because after all, one of the reasons why we're going to be in a very, very major recession, even though all the indications are we're already there, my fear is that all the economic indicators are showing that, in fact, the recession will not even start to peak or trough, as the case may be, until the middle of next year. What that shows to me is that the only way we are going to get governments and capital to respond to us is by taking collective action to reinforce our arguments. And I think that, and I really think that that we have this moment or series of moments. It's not something that's simply going to disappear in a day or a week or a month. But we need to seize collective action, which I think might possibly change the argument and change the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And it's fair to say that if facts were the only thing that would that's needed to make things better, my God, what a different world we'd be in right now. That was the case. That's why we need collective action. We've run out of time. So there's one last question, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So my apologies to the questioner. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Thank you to all of our panelists for incredible contributions. Thank you for all the questioners for asking your questions. They were all top-notch and high-quality questions going through various elements of all the presentations. Thank you for that. And also thank you for your patience with a couple of technical issues we had over the course of the last hour and a half. I wanted to finish off with a little plug, which is that AFTINET is a network of 60 community organisations and many more individuals, which is funded by memberships and donations. We don't receive any government or corporate funding. If you want to find out more, to join, to donate to AFTINET, please do so through our website, www.aftinet.org.au. Thank you so much again, everyone. Have a great day, and let's keep up the struggle for fair trade. Goodbye.
Bye.